Good evening, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and welcome to another round of Cromwellathon. So this is the fourth week of talking about Hilary Mantel's book about Thomas Cromwell, Wolf Hall, and it's going to be followed by Bringing Up the Bodies and then The Mirror and the Light eventually. So I took some notes this week of things that I was thinking of talking about. I actually accidentally read one chapter too many, so I read to the end of the chapter Devil's Spit. I tried really hard. I was like, I've got to stop at the end of this chapter because I don't want to read ahead, but I'd already read ahead unknowingly, but I will. So one of the things that kind of stood out for me in this period was the recurrence of the idea of people getting made. And I think both Henry and Anne say to Cromwell that they are going to make them, that you know, everything you are is going to be because of me, and I can make you completely, and things like that. And I found that really interesting because obviously we see Cromwell as being the one that's pulling the strings, and we also see him as being somebody who makes other people, as in he makes Rafe, and he makes like various like connections and the people within his household. He gives them roles and positions, but people kind of think that they have that kind of power over Cromwell, but then he's deciding what he wants to be made into. So there's a point where Anne, I think Anne wants something from Cromwell, and he kind of says, oh, well, if you make me master of the House of Jewellers. He doesn't directly say, if you do this, I'll do that. But the suggestion is, like, because I'm able to get you this, you are able to get me the other. So this kind of reciprocal relationship where he is deciding what he's going to give people for what he wants to get out of it. So he's quite calculating in that, but there's still this idea of people saying that they've made him, and I wonder if that's going to come up later on when people are going to kind of throw it back at him and say, you know, or you know, why are you doing this when I made you? So why aren't you doing exactly what I say? And this idea that if you've made someone, then you should be able to control them. I think that might come back on Cromwell as well. I think members of his household, if I remember history rightly, not all of the members of his household remain strictly loyal to the Cromwell mission. So that could be something that becomes interesting. I particularly like the thing that there's a scene with Harry Percy that is very, very pivotal. I think it's absolutely vital to Cromwell's characterisation in terms of the transition from him being more of a watcher to more of a doer, which Roz and Steve were talking about in Roz's video, and from being like, he becomes more like overtly violent. But also he kind of claims that he has more power than the king. He basically says, Harry Percy says, the king won't let you do that, and he kind of says, well, I know how the financial systems work, so actually it's me who's important here, which, you know, could be seen as vaguely treacherous. I've written that it could be also the beginning of a kind of a hubris. Obviously we see Wolsey come down at the start of the book, and it's almost hard to understand how Cromwell didn't see his own vulnerability. And we do have, as Ros was saying, people like Rafe kind of pointing out, oh, a lot of you're very tied to Anne, like, what are the issues with that? And obviously Cromwell has things in a lot of pies. Yeah, he's got some issues there. And also along the theme of Cromwell being made by various people, obviously Wolsey is the one that really made him, as in Wolsey is the one that brought him to the fore, but the way in which Wolsey made him was quite different and was quite... so Wolsey was always making up these stories about who Cromwell was, and he says things like that he knows it's not worthwhile to try and counter the stories that Wolsey told about him. Like, he knows that people will just believe them even if he denies them. So like Wolsey's little kind of fairy tales or origin myths for Cromwell also have that impact, which is quite entertaining. Yeah, so I mentioned that Percy scene as being kind of the start of Cromwell's more aggressive behaviour. It made me feel quite uncomfortable. I didn't like to see him suddenly turning on somebody when he pushes the man up against the wall. But then I was thinking back, like, we've always known that Cromwell is a character who is very capable of violence. The very first scene that we meet him in, we meet him as the sympathetic character, as in we meet him getting attacked. But then he says that he remembers there being a fight, and he remembers there being a knife, and he hasn't been stabbed himself. So his the speculation is that if somebody got stabbed, it's got to be the person that he was fighting. And then there's also the later scene with Wolsey when he reacts as though he's about to turn on an assassin. So we've always known Cromwell was somebody who was capable of violence. Those two scenes seem to be more in a kind of self-defense context, whereas this seems to be in more of a becoming someone that people are afraid of type of context. What I was really questioning in this section at times was why Cromwell is doing what he is doing. As in, when at first he's very loyal to Wolsey, and we can see that when he's moving into court and when he's starting to interact with people like Anne Boleyn and directly with people like Henry, we can see that what he really wants to do is reinstate Wolsey, and he keeps saying to people, like subtly saying to them basically, you know, you could bring the cardinal back, or, you know, you would be better off if the cardinal was in charge of this. And then I kind of realised that by this stage, Wolsey's dead, and Cromwell is entirely doing this for himself, and it doesn't, in many ways, make sense on a surface level, as in, he comes across as somebody who is very sensible and very out to protect himself, rather than being someone who's very ambitious, but he's now acting like an ambitious person. And in the immediate period after Wolsey's death, you could say it's because he is trying to protect his own family and so on. But now I start to think, like, what is the reason? Why is he suddenly so ambitious? Why is he suddenly so in favour, for instance, of Anne, when at first he was kind of more holding back his opinion on that? So I was wondering whether it's a religious motivation, whether he is actually really keen on this idea of the Reformation and he wants to be able to forward it. I think Ros and Steve were talking about the fact that he's a merchant, and maybe he wants to use his power to create more stability, and maybe that's his motivation, that he wants, like, financially to prosper. Although I agree that he still sees himself as a merchant, I don't necessarily think that that's enough of a motive to get so into, like, the nitty-gritty of court behaviour. Like, he could still remain aloof, or move to an area with a better financial system. Like, he's already shown that he's not somebody who is completely tied to England. He spent so many years abroad. Yeah, and the safest thing for him to do would be to get out, actually, and just avoid the situation that is beginning to brew. I kind of questioned whether perhaps he was a little bit attracted to Anne himself. I know there's a lot of time in the book spent building up maybe a little bit of tension between him and Mary Boleyn, or him and Jane Seymour, who are other women in Anne's circle. But I did notice a couple of moments when, in the last video, I talked about how he compared Anne unfavourably to a tapestry version of a woman who he knew in the past. But this time he talks about, there's a scene where he talks about, like, following the line of her clothes down over her breasts and so on. That's quite a sensual description of her. So yeah, I found that intriguing, and maybe that he's promoting her successes because he's kind of come under her thrall, as it were. Like, he's under her power almost, even though he doesn't see himself as being that. Yeah, then there was something that I wanted to say about the ruby that he gets from the French king, and I can't remember exactly what it was. Something about, like, bribery and loyalty, and the idea that you know, can he or can he not be bought, and so on, and the way that he takes it back to Henry and, like, hands it over is very symbolic of, like, you know, I'm true to you. And this idea that the French king called him over to talk to him just to ask, oh, you know, are you Welsh, and then tried to and use that as an opportunity to try to bribe him, but I can't remember the details of it. And the other thing was, I've been using this little World of Wolf Hall booklet for the book group questions at the back. So the question that I have chosen for today, I read last week. this little book, which is a biography of Henry VIII. It is tiny. It's the most basic little book. I'll talk more about it in a different video. But it's Henry VIII. I think it's called The Quest for Fame. Yeah, Henry VIII, The Quest for Fame, and it's by John Guy. And book club questions. How much does the world of the book seem different to our own times? How familiar are some of the power struggles and the divisions? So I'm just going to leave you with the thought that I wrote down in my notes. That the Tudor period is a period that we study in history. We don't study things like the Magna Carta, we don't study the Civil War, but the topics that are chosen to be focused on in schools are like, they are part of the origin myth of a country, and we focus on this idea of Henry throwing off the power of the Pope and, you know, relinquishing England from the power of Europe, and the Reformation of destroying all the wealth of the churches, without talking about the violence that accompanied that, and without talking about, like, we talk about Henry's 6 wives as something, you know, a little bit, oh, get this English king and he's so, you know, virile and all of that. Like, that's not the words that are used, but that's the implication of, like, this kind of, like, potent English monarch, basically, even though he fails to produce an heir for a very long time. But that's essentially the narrative that's there. You know, we don't, yeah, like, why don't, what am I trying to say? So the idea of the Tudors is that they represented a united England compared to the time that went before them, and they started to have, like, signs of culture, in terms of that was the period where the theatre started to become a big thing, and like this idea of independent, forward-thinking Britain. But the historical reality is not that simple. The historical reality is that Henry's attempts to break away from the European power systems and enable self-determination for himself and for Britain did not go well. So England was left with a slightly paunchy leader, humiliated in his dealings with his European neighbours, with few international allies, domestic chaos, and a whole lot of money wasted. Now, why does that sound familiar? Anyway, I hope you enjoy reading the next section, and I will speak to you soon.